Well, endangered typically is any species of animal that on the way out or at risk of becoming extinct.
A species that is endangered means that without some type of intervention by us, those animals will disappear from the world entirely. They'll go extinct in the wild.
Needs to be at risk of extinction in a portion or throughout its range.
In the 1980s, I got started in Indiana. All across the Midwest, bald eagles were low populations at the time. Well, a lot of it was disturbance of their habitat for nesting. A lot of it was just outright shooting. I mean, big bird, easy target, sits on real exposed branches. During the post-World War II period, we started using a lot more chemicals, and some of those chemicals have had impacts on them. So mercury, PCBs, DDT, and other things like that had impact on their reproduction, and so they weren't producing enough babies. So it's kind of the triple whammy going at the same time. You've got habitat loss, you've got poisoning going on, then you've got shooting happening. So with all those combined, they were pretty much wiped out. Ohio had at one point about 4 or 5 nests left on Lake Erie only, no place else in the state. Indiana, they were gone. Well, DDT is a chemical that gets in fat, okay? PCBs are the same thing, mercury does the same thing. And essentially, it builds up in the fat tissue of the animal, which is not a problem then, when they're fat, healthy, and everything else. But then when hunger comes in the winter, or when egg laying comes, the bird starts using up fat reserves, and that stuff gets in their bloodstream. And the big problem was when a bird lays an egg, if it's got toxins in its body and it's fat, it essentially dumps as much as 10 times the amount that's in it into the egg. So it's one way it has of getting rid of some of that excess stuff, but the only problem is then that means you've essentially poisoned the young. Predators were considered bad guys. Bears disappeared in mid-1800s. Mountain lions, wolves, all those are kind of considered bad guys. As we got into the 1900s, then we started working on things like foxes and bobcat and, eliminating some of those. We figured they were eating what we wanted. They were eating some of our crops, eating some of our livestock, and that kind of thing. And so really that was a lot of it. At one point, even the state agencies encouraged getting rid of predators. So we were encouraging people to shoot hawks. Even after the Bald Eagle Act was passed, some states in the Union still had bounties for a pair of feet of a bald eagle. It was kind of a long, hard road turning that around. I think a lot of people have become more conservation minded over the last 100 years. We think about back in the turn of the century, 1900, that's when bison, which were all across the United States, 70 million, more numerous than any other large mammal in the world, all of a sudden they were down to 500. People go, whoa. Another thing was huge was the passenger pigeon. That is one that went extinct. It was the most common bird in North America at one time. In fact, they flew over in migration and blacken the sky all day as they passed. And they were everywhere. People would shoot them at night on the roosts and sell the meat. That reduced those guys down to very few. The very last one was shot here in Ohio. And so people went, scratch their heads and go, wow, how could something that we never thought we would run out of all of a sudden be gone? Okay, no more in the world. There's nothing like them anywhere else in the world. It was a forest-dwelling, rosy-breasted bird. That, I think, started people to wake up. Conservation became important. Guys like Teddy Roosevelt, pushed that sort of thing. But then after the post-war years, chemicals and things like that, people began to get concerned about that as well. Change of heart, kind of taken a long time to get it going. Federal government got into the Endangered Species Act, so that was a law that essentially enabled them to protect certain species. Bald eagles had been protected since the Bald Eagle Act many years ago in the 1940s. We started restricting some of the use of some of these chemicals. That was a huge thing as far as their reproductive ability. We started creating reservoirs. And so you think about that for a minute, it's magnified the habitat that they need. They were found on the rivers in Ohio originally, but Ohio didn't have a whole lot of big lakes. But we got them now. Then on top of that, we have a situation where people have sort of changed their hearts. When we were releasing eagles, people were still shooting them. So even the birds that we had been radio tracking, following around, ended up dead somewhere. You know, that attitude has kind of changed. People want to see them around. And so a lot of people who had been doing the illegal shooting, their minds have changed and they're being more responsible, I guess, in that sense. I got started in a project called hacking, which is actually kidnapping them from a state where they're common, bringing them to another state, putting them on a big tower with a reasonable facsimile of a nest inside of a cage, and then those birds are raised there for a month or so. They're released with the idea that where they're raised, they're going to come home. We had Wisconsin and Alaskan eagles that were kidnapped and brought to southern Indiana and released down there. We released about 73 birds. They're also important ingredients in the natural ecosystem, and if we're missing pieces and parts of it, other things can topple and start to cause problems. We have different and varied species, wildlife, trees, and wildflowers and everything else here in Ohio. It's all something that we should have some kind of a responsibility toward.
White rhinos are a very unique animal. When the Europeans got to southern Africa in the late 1800s, unregulated hunting pretty much wiped them out. And it's only through really tremendous conservation effort on the part of the South Africans that turned that around. So today, there's almost 20,000 white rhinos out there, which is fantastic. Now, the downside is these days, the big pressure we face right now is from poaching. So these animals are killed for their horns, and it's used in mainly the main market is a traditional Asian medicine. People ascribe a number of different medicinal qualities to it, and none of that's ever been proven. Essentially, the horn is keratin. It's the same material that makes up fingernails and toenails, and it has no medical value. But these animals are killed, and the horn is ground up and consumed for various uses in the Asian market. And that's the big problem. In the past several years, we had seen a really marked increase in poaching pressure on rhinos, and it's essentially organized crime. There's a market, there's money to be made, and there are people that make a whole lot of money killing rhinos and selling rhino horn. The big market now seems to be in Asia, in China and Vietnam especially. I do know that there's a case ascribed to a high-level politician who claimed that rhino horn had cured his cancer, and they thought that drove a new demand for the horn. There's been a number of different things that have tried to protect rhinos, whether it's removing their horns. Some people have gone as far as to implant GPS trackers in horns, so if a horn's taken, it can be followed. People have tried to essentially poison horns, to taint them some way to make them so they wouldn't be usable. And all these things are, they're good ideas. There are different ways to approach it. The problem is that even if you cut off a rhino's horn, it continues to grow. And that little bit that's left still has value. And, so I don't know that, in the middle of the night when you're sneaking up on a rhino, how carefully they're measuring the horns before they shoot, So the other thing we know is that you can also alter the animal's behavior and ability to protect itself if you remove the horn. So left out on their own, if you take away the rhino's horn, which is its primary defensive weapon, if it's not in a protected area, then it could get in trouble as well. It's hard to protect these animals. They're out in the wide open spaces. There's a lot of room to cover, a lot of ground to cover. And, these are people that are carrying high-powered firearms. The big effort is more patrolling, watching, keeping track of the borders, getting more people out there where they can see them. They're working on things like aerial surveillance using unmanned drones and all kinds of other high-tech efforts. But ultimately, it's going to take boots on the ground and people out there watching the animals. And the second part of it is going out there and trying to reduce the demand. So there's groups like Education Nature Vietnam, which is funded by the Columbus News Conservation Grant Program. They do a tremendous job of going out there and trying to reduce the demand in Vietnam for a rhino horn. And so it's a combination of efforts of trying to convince people that not to buy the product, but then also to be out there on the ground protecting the animals as well. Northern white rhino was believed to be a distinct subspecies of rhino. There are some people who think that it could be a distinct species, and that's for scientists who know a whole lot more about this than me to say. But they were separated, essentially. The southern white rhinos are in the 5 main countries of southern Africa, and then the northern white rhinos up in Central Africa. When the rhino effort came to protect rhinos, they were very well protected in the southern countries. In the northern countries, a lot of geopolitical conflict, a lot of civil wars, other things in that area. It makes it difficult to protect rhinos. Human life and human issues will take precedence over that. And the northern white rhinos were essentially wiped out. There were a handful left in zoos, and they came back to a reserve in Kenya. But functionally, since they'll never be able to breed with another northern white rhino, the species is extinct. We've lost so many things, not just the northern white rhino, but other species as well. There are some efforts to reestablish rhino populations in Central Africa using southern white rhinos. And there's some pretty incredible scientific efforts being made essentially to resurrect the northern white rhino. We're talking Jurassic Park level stuff here. With the genetic material that's been saved from the animals that were in zoos, the idea would be that eventually you could create, essentially clone, a northern white rhino and get a southern white rhino to carry that baby. Yeah, we're obviously, the loss of the northern white rhino is a tragedy. And the problem was we were too late. And we're not too late for some other animals. We're not too late for the southern white rhino. We're not too late for some of the others. And that's why we really want to make people aware of the issues that face rhinos and to go out there and, like they say, go to the International Rhino Foundation, go to some of the other conservation groups and learn about them and help support them. Well, the main thing we do at the Wilds with the rhinos is we're involved in the conservation breeding programs, the species survival plans that are part of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, our National Zoo Association. There's about 250 white rhinos in that breeding program. The Wilds has been a big part of that. Well, one of the reasons that we're so proud of the program here is the number of babies that have been born here. We've had over 20 rhinos born at the Wilds. The very first one was in 2004. And as we've talked about, the fact that we've got animals that are born 4 and 5 generations removed from the wild, no one else outside of Africa can claim that. So we've got these beautiful wide open spaces. We can keep the animals in a natural social group, eating natural vegetation out here. It's about as close to being wild rhinos as we can get here in the United States. And what people can do for conservation is, and we do talk about things, so you can recycle and save water and watch plastic waste and all those kind of things. And that may not seem to directly impact rhinos, but it's a mindset, and it's thinking about the whole world and how everything's interconnected and what we can do to impact that. I mean, obviously you can directly do things, you can donate to the various rhino conservation organizations, you can help support the Wilds and what we do for the breeding programs out here. But a lot of it is the conservation, is the mindset of being aware that we have a huge impact on our world and what you can do to limit that impact and make sure that what you're doing is a positive and not a negative.
They had been hunted to near extinction because of their meat is kind of a flavorful meat to certain people, being that they're vegetarian and so it's not oily and fishy and so forth. And they had actually been extirpated from a number of the islands in the Caribbean and reduced to quite low numbers in Florida. So it was a natural that they would be on that original endangered species list because they were literally at a risk of becoming extinct. When a boat's going quite fast, there's not a lot of time for the manatee to get out of the way. There's less time for the boater to take action. And so being a boater myself and working with a lot of boaters over the years, I do know that they care and they want to make a difference. But it's most of the time not possible to actually see the manatee. So it's important that we protect by causing those boats to either not go into a certain area or to slow down dramatically, so it gives time for the manatee to get out of the way from the boat too. I do ask boaters to watch out, avoid shallow water areas like seagrasses where manatees feed, to wear polarized sunglasses, look for the manatee's nose when they're surfacing, and even look for little flat spots on the top of the water when a manatee's swimming. Right behind it, you'll see a series of flat spots. Red tide is a dinoflagellate, and so that won't mean a lot to a lot of people, but it's a little bitty, sort of almost microscopic size organism that bloom into the millions and billions of little teeny, types of phytoplankton. They also produce internally what's called a brevetoxin. That brevetoxin, when it's released to the water or even in an aerosol in the air, can be quite toxic. So it really becomes almost like a neurotoxin. So manatees can become paralyzed, they cannot be able to swim, they would end up drowning. And it can also be consumed even sometime later when it gets into some of the seagrass beds and things like that as well. And even though we looked at nearly 300 that we knew died from red tide, there was probably another 100 or more that you just couldn't determine what actually killed them because of the circumstances, so it was probably even more than that. The more we've learned about red tide is that it is a naturally occurring organism, but that being said, it tends to be exacerbated by the water pollution, so extra nutrients and so forth. That doesn't start it, but it can actually make it persist longer and become even a little more virulent. So, and the things we need to do to protect against the brown tides and the blue-green algal blooms and those things are things that can actually help us dealing with red tide as well, because having the cleaner water we have, really the better that aquatic environment's going to be. There was political pressure being brought on the Fish and Wildlife Service. They were actually sued by an organization, oddly enough, called Save Crystal River. It was not an organization that cared about manatees at the time, nor did they really care about the quality of the water in a true sense, because many of their actions were showing that they wanted to strip away the protections for manatees because they really didn't want to have to slow the boats down. That was sort of the initial nexus of why they sued. I will say in their defense today, I worked with them for many different years and helping them to learn how to better protect the aquatic environment. And they listened. We had to actually stop them in court. A few years later, they came around. They're using techniques to remove some of the silt and problems in the environment and replant vegetation. So they've actually gone from an organization that was doing great harm to the environment to one that's kind of a little bit better on the positive side. But we're still disagreeing over whether or not manatee rules should stay in place. And quietly, some of them have told me, you know what, we think that the rules were good after. When they moved to downlist manatees from endangered to threatened, they were supposed to follow the rules, but they really didn't. Because if a species is endangered, remains endangered in a portion of the range, they're supposed to leave the entire species at the endangered level. But they chose to ignore that rule, and it's something that may be litigated further in the future, because manatees are clearly endangered throughout many of the Caribbean islands and portions even outside the United States that would be covered by the IUCN international standards. And so even if you argued that just the manatees in the United States proper were met the definition of threatened, they still should have been required to keep them listed as endangered, because they were still endangered in a significant issue. We're hugely involved in the Manatee Rescue and Rehabilitation Partnership. So we work with a series of other organizations, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the state of Florida, Fish and Wildlife Commission, there's the Cincinnati Zoo, and working with the Columbus Zoo. They're a part of that partnership as well. We're making sure that when a manatee is sick or injured, we're going to be able to get somebody out there to rescue it, that it has a place to go to be nursed back to health, and then when it's well enough, it's put back into the wild and followed through radio transmitters, things like that. That's one big area. We do a lot of education and outreach and making sure people understand, just like today we're talking about, what are the problems and what can you do about it. So besides what we do in Florida and helping to make sure the protections and regulations are there and they're enforced, we also help with rescue programs, say, in West Africa, and helping with aquatic ecosystem issues there as well. Central America. We're also working in the Caribbean islands. In Belize is especially an important area where we've been working to try to help with local organizations there. So wherever manatees are in need, we're going to be trying to be there to help them in research as well, like at Blue Spring. We are maintaining in partnership now our cameras, both for research as well as for people to see and enjoy them over the internet and hopefully become enamored with manatees and to do something. Manatees are us. So if it has to do with their health and welfare, we're going to be involved. We can only do that if people help us make that difference. We can only do so much as the staff for the organization, and we need others to be engaged in it.
Hi, I'm Jimmy Buffett. Save the Manatee Club has helped to protect imperiled manatees and their aquatic habitat for decades, but there's still more work to be done. Threats from cold weather, red tides, pollution, and boat collisions continue to take their toll on the manatee. So let's work together to safeguard the manatees and the places they call home. Be the friend they need. Visit SaveTheManatee.org. Thank you.